Hello and welcome to Short Story Summer, which is a booktube event where we read short stories. And today I will read one out loud to you from this collected edition of stories by Eudora Welty. And yeah, I will read a piece of news which I thought was an excellent story, and I'll give it a little bit of commentary along the way, and maybe it will inspire you to pick up some short stories yourself. So let's get started. A piece of news by Eudora Welty. She had been out in the rain. She stood in front of the cabin fireplace, her legs wide apart, bending over, shaking her wet yellow head crossly, like a cat reproaching itself for not knowing better. She was talking to herself, only a small, fluttering sound, hard to lay hold of in the sparsity of the room. The pouring down rain, was what she was saying over and over, like a song. She stood turning in little quarter turns to dry herself, her head bent forward, and the yellow hair hanging out streaming and tangled. She was holding her skirt primly out to draw the warmth in. Then, quite rosy, she walked over to the table and picked up a little bundle. It was a sack of coffee marked "Sample" in red letters, which she unwrapped from a wet newspaper. But she handled it tenderly. "Why, how come he wrapped it in a newspaper?" she said, catching her breath, looking from one hand to the other. She must have been lonesome and slow all her life, the way things would take her by surprise. She set the coffee on the table, just in the center. Then she dragged the newspaper by one corner in a dreamy walk across the floor, spread it out, and lay down full length on top of it in front of the fire. Her little song about the rain, her cries of surprise, had only had been only a preliminary, only playful pouting with which she amused herself when she was alone. She was pleased with herself now. As she sprawled close to the fire, her hair began to slide out of its damp tangles and hung all displayed down her back like a piece of bargain silk. She closed her eyes. Her mouth fell into a deepness, into a look of unconscious cunning. Yet, in her very stillness and pleasure, she seemed to be hiding there, all alone. And at moments when the fire stirred and tumbled in the grate, she would tremble, and her hand would start out as if in impatience or despair. Presently, she stirred and reached under her back for the newspaper. Then she squatted there, touching the printed page as if it was fragile. She did not merely look at it, she watched it as if it was unpredictable, like a young girl watching a baby. The paper was still wet in places where her body had lain. Crouching tensely and patting the creases away with small cracked red fingers, she frowned now and then at the blotched drawing of something and big letters that spelled a word underneath. Her lips trembled, as if looking and spelling so slowly had stirred her heart. All at once she laughed. She looked up. "Ruby Fisher," she whispered. An expression of utter timidity came over her flat blue eyes and her soft mouth. Then a look of fright. She stared about. What eye in the world did she feel looking in on her? She pulled her dress down tightly and began to spell through a dozen words in the newspaper. The little item said, "Mrs. Ruby Fisher had the misfortune to be shot in the leg by her husband this week." As she passed from one word to the next, she only whispered. She left the long word "misfortune" until the last, and came back to it. Then she said it all over out loud, like conversation. "That's me," she said softly, with deference, very formally. The fire slipped and suddenly roared in the house, already deafening with the rain, which beat upon the roof and hung full of lightning and thunder outside. "You, Clyde!" screamed Ruby Fisher at last, jumping to her feet. "Where are you, Clyde Fisher?" She ran straight to the door and pulled it open. A shudder of cold brushed over her in the heat, and she seemed striped with anger and bewilderment. There was a flash of lightning, and she stood waiting, as if she half thought that would bring him in, a gun leveled in his hand. She said nothing more, and backing against the door, pushed it close with her hip. Her anger passed like a remote flare of elation. Neatly avoiding the table where the bag of coffee stood, she began to walk nervously about the room, as if a teasing indecision and untouched mystery led her by the hand. There was one window, and she paused now and then, waiting, looking out at the rain. When she was still, there was a passivity about her, or deception of passivity, that was not really passive at all. There was something in her that never stopped. At last she flung herself onto the floor, back across the newspaper, and looked at length into the fire. It might have been a mirror in the cabin into which she could look deeper and deeper as she pulled her fingers through her hair, trying to see herself and Clyde coming up behind her. There's another 2 pages, but already this is quite an eerie and tense story. We have a feeling um, of this woman being quite isolated out in a cabin, and reading in a newspaper that she has been shot by her husband, even though she clearly hasn't. Um, and it's rain and thunder, and her behavior is a little bit strange. She's clearly a little bit simple. She can hardly read. It's just it's a very tense and quite engaging start to the story. It's only 3 more pages. She continues. Clyde, but of course her husband Clyde was still in the woods. He kept a thick brushwood roof over his whiskey still, and he was mortally afraid of lightning like this, and would never go out in it for anything. And then, almost in amazement, she began to comprehend her predicament. It was unlike Clyde to take up a gun and shoot her. Thank God for that. She bowed her head toward the heat, onto her rosy arms, and began to talk and talk to herself. She grew voluble. Even if he heard about the coffeeman with a Pontiac car, she did not think he would shoot her. Who's that guy? When Clyde would make her blue, now I think that could potentially have some double meaning. When Clyde would make her blue, I thought it indicated that he beat her, could also indicate that he makes her sad or depressed, although it's written in 1937, so I don't know if that was how you would express something like that at the time. But let's go on. When Clyde would make her blue, she would go out onto the road, some car would slow down, and if it had a Tennessee license, the lucky kind, the chances were that she would spend the afternoon in the shed of the empty gin. Parenthesis. Here she rolled her head about on her arms and stretched her legs tiredly behind her like a cat. Parenthesis. End. And if Clive got word, he would slap her. But the account in the paper was wrong. Clive had never shot her, even once. There had been a mistake made. So we get again the feeling that she's quite isolated, she's quite alone, but she sometimes go out and hitchhikes, picks up a ride from someone and goes somewhere, maybe does some things that Clyde certainly doesn't like, and then he beats her. A spark flew out and nearly caught the paper on fire. Almost in fright, she beat it out with her fingers. Then she murmured and lay back more firmly upon the pages. There she stretched, growing warmer and warmer, sleepier and sleepier. She began to wonder out loud how it could be if Clyde shot her in the leg. If he were truly angry, might he shoot her through her heart? At once she was imagining herself dying. She would have a nightgown to lie in and a bullet in her heart. Anyone could tell, to see her lying there with that deep expression about her mouth, how strange and terrible that would be. Underneath the brand new nightgown, her heart would be hurting with every beat, many times more than her toughened skin when Clyde slapped at her. Ruby began to cry softly, the way she would be crying from the extremity of pain. Tears would run down in a little stream over the quilt. Clyde would be standing there above her, as he once looked, with his wild black hair hanging to his shoulders. He used to be very handsome and strong. So the past tense, he used to be very handsome and strong, and indications that she is, quite alone, lonely. He's beating her. You get the idea that this is a couple living somewhere rural in the woods, um, in a quite unhappy or quite sort of habitual relationship, and she is, feeling a lot of existential loneliness and a longing to connect to other people, which is why she goes out to get um, to meet strangers that drive by, and she goes with them wherever they're going. Um, he would say, Clyde, that is, Ruby, I done this to you. She would say, only a whisper, that's the truth, Clyde, you done this to me. So she's lying there imagining what it would be like if Clyde had shot her and that he had killed her. And this imagination is seems quite appealing to her. Then she would die, her life would stop right there. She lay silently for a moment, composing her face into a look which would be beautiful, desirable, and dead. Clyde would have to buy her a dress to bury her in. He would have to dig a deep hole behind the house under the cedar, a grave. He would have to nail her up a pine coffin and lay her inside. Then he would have to carry her to the grave, lay her down, and cover her up. All the time he would be wild, shouting and all distracted, to think he could never touch her one more time. So this is her having a fantasy of Clyde being jealous and having shot and killed her and all the things he would have to do if he actually did so, giving sort of an indication that he doesn't really do anything for her presently, and she doesn't really feel that he is seeing her and that he acknowledges her and that he is in any way sort of treating her as a partner in a marriage. She moved slightly and her eyes turned toward the window. The white rain splashed down. She could hardly breathe for thinking that this was the way it was to fall on her grave, where Clyde would come and stand, looking down in the tears of some repentance. A whole three of lightning stood in the sky. She kept looking out the window, suffused with the warmth from the fire and with the pity and beauty and power of her death. The thunder rolled. So there's a bit of this gothic setting in the middle of a dark forest, all alone, thunder and rain, and this fantasy of dying. And she falls asleep, right? So then, next paragraph. But then Clyde was standing there, with dark streams flowing over the floor where he had walked. He poked at Ruby with the butt of his gun, as if she were asleep. Or maybe she wasn't asleep, just daydreaming, awake. What's keeping supper? He growled. She jumped up and darted away from him. Then, quicker than lightning, she put away the paper. The room was dark, except for the firelight. From the long shadow of his steamy presence, she spoke to him glibly and lighted the lamp. He stood there with a stunned yet rather good-humored look of delay and patience in his face, and kept on standing there. He stamped his mud-red boots, and his enormous hands seemed weighted with the rain that fell from him and dripped down the barrel of the gun. So we have the gun there, right? So there is a tension here. There is a potential for violence. Presently he sat down with dignity in the chair at the table, making a little tumult of his rightful wetness and hunger. Small streams began to flow from him everywhere. Ruby was going through the preparations for the meal gently. She stood almost on tiptoe in her bare warm feet. Once as she knelt at the safe, getting out the biscuits, she saw Clyde looking at her, and she smiled and bent her head tenderly. For some way she began to move her arms that was mysteriously sweet and yet abrupt and tentative, a delicate and vulnerable manner, as though her breasts gave her pain. She made many unnecessary trips back and forth across the floor, circling Clyde where he sat in his steamy silence, a knife and fork in his fist. Well, where you been anyway? He grumbled at last, as she set the first dish on the table. Nowhere special. Don't you talk back to me. You've been hitchhiking again, ain't you? He almost chuckled. She gave him a quick look straight into his eyes. She had not even heard him. She was filled with happiness. This is strange, right? He's accusing her of doing something that he doesn't want her to do, and she's filled with happiness. I guess just from the conversation and from sort of the daydreaming that she's been having of him being jealous and killing her. Her hand trembled when she poured the coffee. Some of it splashed on his wrist. At that, he let his hand drop heavily down upon the table and made the plates jump. So he definitely got some temper, this Clyde fellow. Someday I'm going to smack the living devil out of you, he said. Yeah. Ruby dodged mechanically. She let him eat. Then, when he had crossed his knife and fork over his plate, she brought in the newspaper. Again, she looked at him in delight. She's very thrilled about this person in the paper and her imagining that it's her. And it is her name, so at the same time, as we're reading this for the first time, we're a little bit confused about what sort of things is going on. And newspaper. Clive snatched it roughly and with a grabbing disparagement. Where do you get that, hussy? Look at this here, said Ruby in her small sing-song voice. She opened the paper where he held it and pointed gravely to the paragraph. Reluctantly, Clyde began to read it. She watched his damp bald head slowly bend and turn. Then he made a sound in his throat and said, It's a lie. That's what's in the newspaper about me. said Ruby, standing up straight. She took up his plate and gave him that look of joy. She's very thrilled at being in the newspaper as having been seen, recognized, acknowledged as a human being, even if it takes for her to get shot. Um, it seems to be that she would prefer that over her somewhat joyless marriage. He put his big, crooked finger on the paragraph and poked at it. Well, I'd just like to see the place I shot you, he cried explosively. He looked up, his face blank and bold. But she drew herself in, still holding the empty plate, faced him, straightened and hard, and they looked at each other. The moment filled full with their helplessness. Slowly they both flushed, as though with a double shame and a double pleasure. It was as though Clyde might really have killed Ruby, and as though Ruby might really have been dead at his hand. Rare and wavering, some possibility stood timidly like a stranger between them and made them hang their heads. Then Clyde walked over in his water-soaked boots and laid the paper on the dying fire. It floated there a moment and then burst into flame. So the paper is gone. They stood still and watched it burn. The whole room was bright. Look, said Clyde suddenly, it's a Tennessee paper. See, Tennessee. That wasn't none of you it wrote about. He laughed, as if he's also in doubt whether he shot her or not. Strange. To show that he had been right all the time. It was Ruby Fisher, cried Ruby. My name is Ruby Fisher, she declared passionately to Clyde. Oh, it was another Ruby Fisher. In Tennessee, cried her husband. Fool me, huh? Where do you get that paper? He spanked her good-humoredly across her backside. Ruby folded her still trembling hands into her skirt. She stood stooping by the window until everything outside and in was quieted before she went to her supper. It was dark and vague outside. The storm had rolled away to faintness like a wagon crossing a bridge. And that's the story. So it's only 5 pages. Most of these stories so far that I've read, only read a handful so far. I really, really like them. I think this is the best one I've read. It's just, it's very simple, but it has deep psychology and sort of eeriness. And some of the other ones have a lot of carnivalesque, grotesque elements, subdued. But I mean, Eudora Welty can really tell a story, and these very, very short stories, a lot of them, I think it makes a lot of sense to read twice, if it's only 5 or 6 pages, and read them closely, because a lot of short stories seem to have, if they're good, a lot of layers underneath them. And I think so far, with Short Story Summer and with the collection of Flannery O'Connor stories that I read a few weeks ago, that's really what has hooked me onto these type of condensed expressions of fiction, because you can read a small amount of pages, but it contains a whole world within them, and I find it quite fascinating. And I'm really excited to read more from Eudora Welty. So if you want, feel free to let me know what short stories you're reading or which ones you would like to read, and if you like this particular story that I just read out loud. Thank you very much.